Bonne Foi, Chapter 1. It was a moonless, cloudy night, perfect for hunting. Human girls were so stupid, always wandering into poorly lit places alone, late at night, with no one around to call for help. Not that anyone could help them. Humans were a frail mockery in comparison to beings like me, vampires. Over the near century I'd lived as a vampire. I'd perfected my existence. At first it had been impossible to walk among humans without tasting them, but over time my thirst dulled, allowing me to feed every few weeks, once a month if necessary. If I lingered in more highly populated areas, the death toll went largely unnoticed. Not that anyone could catch me. I left no evidence, disguising my feedings as typical homicides, and no one ever guessed. Besides, I could charm the humans easily into believing my innocence, especially when I could hear their thoughts, tell them exactly what they needed to be convinced. Tonight I took the opportunity to feed this evening, since the conditions were ideal, a Monday night too. No one was out around this part of campus, especially so close to the beginning of the school year. Except of course for the pale girl leaving the library just as it closed. I followed her silently until she reached the mouth of an alleyway. I allowed my footsteps to be heard on the pavement then. The girl jumped, then caught her foot on the uneven sidewalk and dropped her books. I approached in the guise of being helpful, making my eyes wide and sincere as I offered my most charming smile. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to scare you," I said, handing her the fallen volumes, which I glanced over quickly, all Jane Austen. Either a helpless romantic or an English major, or both. I smiled to myself. The bookish types were good. A little tangy sometimes, but usually sweet. "That's all right," she said, blushing. The blood rushing to her face combined with the breath she expelled hit me like a wrecking ball. At least what a wrecking ball felt like to be a human. She was so sweet, like Frisia's. The venom ran freely in my mouth, and I knew my black eyes frightened her. Her heart pattered quickly, and she smelled of fear. "I'm just jumpy," she went on, looking at her feet. "You know, with the serial killer running around still." "Right," I said. Little did she know. "You really shouldn't be walking alone like this. It's dangerous." She shrugged. "I don't have much choice. I have to work to pay my tuition, so I have to do my homework late at night." "Let me walk with you," I suggested. I always played with my prey a little before going for the kill, though tonight I certainly was considering veering from the usual plan. I wanted nothing more than to sink my teeth in her throat and drink my fill. She would be oh so satisfying, but that was why I had to be patient. This one was too good to rush, needed to be savored. "Okay," she agreed, hugging her books to her chest as we began to walk. I opened my mind to listen to her thoughts. I needed to get her where no one would hear the screams, because she would certainly be in pain if I drank as slowly as I wanted, and I needed to know what she thought of me to get her there. I concentrated, but there was nothing. I could hear insects rustling in the grass, the air conditioner whirring in the cafeteria, but nothing of her voice. Could her mind really be blank? "May I ask your name?" I tried. Her answer should echo in her thoughts. "Bella Swan?" Nothing. "May I ask yours?" "Edward Mason," I smiled. Her heart rate picked up again, but still no thoughts. I was puzzled. No human just went without thinking. I simply couldn't hear her. That had never happened before, not in 90 years. What was she? Why was her mind closed to me? No matter, I decided. I could charm her without hearing her thoughts. I did this all the time. "Where are you headed?" I asked conventionally, moving a hair closer to her. "Collins," she replied, biting her lip. I almost let out a growl, seeing that lip flush with blood as she released it, but somehow I repressed it. A freshman, then? Did my voice sound as strained to her as it did to me? Small talk was so hard when each breath filled me with her mouth-watering scent. "Yes, what about you?" she asked. Her eyes were curious, strangely curious for such a trite conversation. "A sophomore," I answered. "I tended to stay only a couple of years in one place. I never made it to junior status." "You don't look like a sophomore," she said, frowning as if unable to solve a puzzle. I studied the wrinkle in her forehead as if I would find her thoughts written there. "You don't look like a freshman," I replied, with a roguish grin that usually sent hearts fluttering. Yes, there it was, that little skip in her heartbeat. Beautiful. "What do you do?" she asked. "I mean, what do you study? I know I've never seen you before. I would remember." She blushed again, and I wondered why, even as I cursed her for making this so much harder. If I could just lean in and press my face to her reddened cheek, how delightful she would smell up close. "I haven't declared yet. I never got that far. I'm thinking about psychology, though." I was already an expert on human minds. It made the perfect lie. "What about you?" "English," she replied, just as I suspected. "I've always loved the way a book seems different every time you read it, because your mind processes it differently." "I'm sorry, that was probably more than you wanted to know." "Not at all," I answered, wondering why I was interested. I shrugged it off. The girl was eloquent, but all that meant was she was surprisingly unasinine, nothing special. "Are you from around here, Bella?" I asked. Parents in the area would make her disappearance more of a fuss. Not that it would keep me from killing her. I couldn't resist that blood. "Not really," she said. "I lived with my mom in Phoenix until she remarried when I was 17. I moved to Forks to live with my dad. You've probably never heard of Forks, though." "No, I'm afraid not. A small town?" I was getting impatient, but she wasn't reacting like she was supposed to. Where was the shameless flirting, the silent invitations? She was resisting me more than she should. "Very," she laughed. "Most boring 2 years of my life." I almost rolled my eyes. Small-town types always exaggerated the misery of their existence. "Surely you must have had friends, boyfriends." "No and no," she said, with another blush. "I've never really fit in anywhere." "I can't imagine why. You look normal enough to me, aside from her malfunctioning mind." She shrugged. "It's like my brain works differently than everyone else's or something. It turns people off." Well, I couldn't argue with that. Normal minds are boring anyway. People are so predictable. "I'm surprised you want to study psychology, then." I shrugged, realizing my lie didn't make sense after all. No one had ever paid that much attention. "It's the abnormal minds that are interesting," I said. It was the best I could come up with, but I thought it might be rather true. If I didn't want this girl's blood so badly, this might be a fun challenge. "Well, you'll have fun with me then," she sighed. "Just call me Exhibit A." I snorted. "I can think of better things to do with you than study you." She blushed furiously, and I realized the double entendre in my words. There was the reaction I'd been waiting for. It was the sure way to undo every human's rationality, get them thinking of sex. How laughable. I hadn't thought of sex in years. I'd tried to, of course, with the occasional female vampire I came across, but I couldn't stand to hear their thoughts, so loud and distracting. It was hard to lose myself in the act, when the woman was spending the entire act thinking of herself. I guess I couldn't complain. I thought entirely about myself, too. I cast a contemplative eye on the girl beside me. She continued walking, with her eyes trained on the ground. What would it be like with someone whose mind I couldn't hear? Ridiculous thought. I'd probably crush her halfway through, and that would ruin the fun. I'd have to make her a vampire for it to work, but I wasn't going to leave a drop of her blood remaining. Besides, I worked alone. A partner would only complicate my life. And what were the chances that I'd be able to tolerate her presence for a month, let alone eternity? I shook my head, removing those thoughts. Now wasn't the time for my mind to wander. We were nearing her dorm, and I still hadn't found a way to get her to come away with me. "Do you already have a lot of work?" I asked, gesturing to the books in her arms. "A paper, as usual," she sighed. "That's the one drawback of being an English major. I feel like I have to write a paper about everything I read." "You sound stressed," I said, infusing my voice with sympathy. "I guess," she shrugged. "Like I said, I have to work, so it makes everything harder." "Would you like to come someplace with me?" I asked, deliberately smiling down at her. I needed to be at my most charming. "Of course, if you don't feel comfortable, I would understand, but it's a place I like to go when I need to relax. I think you would enjoy it." She hesitated, glancing at the dorm across the street and then back to me. I smiled innocently. "Okay," she agreed. I smiled as though delighted to have her company. "Wonderful. My car is just down the street." She smiled tentatively back, and I chanced placing my hand on her lower back as I guided her. She shivered but didn't flinch, so I didn't pull away. She started to say, shifting the books in her arms. I silently took them from her, knowing those little acts of chivalry tended to have a positive effect on the females of this species. "Want your girlfriend mind this?" I laughed. She was fishing for information, and she most definitely wasn't subtle. "I don't have a girlfriend," I said, looking at her slyly. "You don't think I invite just anyone to my special place, do you?" There was that damnable blush again. "Well, I don't really know you, do I?" I saw the worry written on her face and smiled again. "I'm not that kind of guy, Bella. Not the kind you're worried about, anyway." "Sorry," she mumbled. "I don't trust people easily." I shrugged. "It's good to be on your guard. The world is a dangerous place." And she had no idea what kind of danger she'd just gotten herself into. "You sound like you're speaking from experience," she said, turning her eyes on me. I wondered if she knew how powerful her eyes were. I'd seen a lot of boring brown eyes on boring girls, but hers weren't like that. I was surprised more human males hadn't been drawn in by them. "I'd seen some unpleasant things in my time," I replied. "I'd done them, mostly, but she didn't need to know that." A few moments of silence followed. "Here's my car," I said as we approached. I smiled at the sight of my prized possession, my beautiful Aston Martin. What a blessing my parents' inheritance was. In the chaos of the Spanish influenza epidemic, no one had noticed my disappearance, and so the estate was left in my name long enough for me to claim it when I could have human contact again. The money accumulated so rapidly now, with various investments and the interest it gained. Now I could afford to spend freely, which I enjoyed. Life was so dull without a few new toys now and then. "Wow," Bella said, eyes widening at the vehicle. "Your parents must be loaded." I opened the door for her. "They were. They died a long time ago." "Oh," she said, her face frozen in horror. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean—" I waved it off. "No need. I've had a long time to get used to it." Being in the car with her was absolute torture. Outside, at least, the breeze had diluted her scent. In the small cab it was stifling. I concentrated on driving out of the city far away from human ears. I saw her turn in her seat out of the corner of my eye. "So I never asked where you were from," she said, giving me that unnaturally curious gaze again. "Chicago," I said, wishing she wouldn't ask me questions so I could hold my breath. "Huh. Why did you decide to come to Washington then? I mean, if you can afford this car, surely you could go anywhere you wanted." Too curious for her own damned good, this one. The thirstier I became, the more annoying she was. I hate the city. I mean, I like to be near a city for its resources, but the noises are unbearable. I'd been completely honest, but she didn't know the half of it. The buzz of millions of thoughts drove me insane, but I couldn't afford to live away from large populations. "That makes sense," she said. "I'm not big on cities either, but I hate Washington. It's too wet." I couldn't stop the chuckles that escaped. "Yes, it is that." Which was precisely why I chose it. "Where are we going that's so far outside the city?" she asked as I drove up the highway. "A place in the wilderness, just far enough from civilization." She bit her lip and I smelled fear again. So she was finally starting to get nervous. If only she knew it had been too late for her the moment she left the library. "You're not an axe murderer, are you?" I was surprised she came out and asked, but I suppose she wanted to be reassured now that she was trapped. "No," I laughed. "The axe wasn't necessary." "Well, good," she sighed. "I sort of like my head where it is." I snorted. The girl's mind went to absurd places. "Tell me more about you," she said next. I glanced again at her face, so eager. "What do you want to know?" "I don't know. What are your interests? What do you do when you're not in class?" I tried to think of the things I did that would sound normal to her. "Well, I run. I read a lot and listen to music. I watch a lot of films too." All the things one had to do to pass the long hours that were meant for sleeping, the things I had to do to retain my sanity. "What's your favorite book?" she asked immediately. I realized I must have stumbled upon her favorite subject. I had to think about it. "The Stranger." "Camus?" She sounded incredulous. "You like existentialism?" I raised an eyebrow. "You don't?" "No, I do," she said. "I think it's a great philosophy, living your life to be the best you can be, and taking responsibility for your actions, whether others judge them as good or bad." What had I gotten myself into? That's not quite what I got out of it. "Oh?" Now her eyebrow was raised. "What did you think?" "Meursault acts outside of society's expectations, but he's still bound by them. It's not until he accepts that it doesn't really matter that he's finally happy." The smirk on her face surprised me. She was looking at me like I was a complete idiot. No one had ever given me that look before. "I think you sort of missed the point," she said eventually. "Meursault was miserable because he never took responsibility for his life. He just drifted through it, accepting whatever he thought fate threw at him. He was finally happy when he truly accepted that there was nothing more than this life, no God, no heaven, and no fate. He realized we have only one life, and that it's the sum of our choices that make up the outcome, not what's handed to us." I couldn't help it. I stared at her. She shifted uncomfortably. "What? Does that not make sense?" "No, it makes perfect sense. I'm just surprised at your perceptiveness," I answered honestly. I almost reconsidered killing her. The world could use a mind like hers. "Did you think I was just some dumb girl?" she asked defensively. "No," I smirked. "It was hard to miss that pile of books in your arms. I'm just amazed." No one's ever made me feel like such an idiot before. Sorry, she mumbled. I tend to speak before I think sometimes. Don't apologize, I said, spotting the mile marker I used as a landmark ahead. It was refreshing, and we're here. I pulled over to the side of the road, and I saw her tense, looking at the dark road ahead and the trees to either side. Is this it? She asked, more fear. No, it's just through the trees there. I pulled out my best trick, looking at her through my eyelashes. You trust me, don't you? She nodded. I smiled and stepped out of the car, meeting her on the passenger side. Our conversation had distracted me, but the impatience was returning now, urging the venom to flow. I led her through the trees. As promised, the clearing was just on the other side, a small circle of trees, like a wall against the world. She walked into the center, and I followed slowly, letting her scent fall in waves against me. Wow, Bella murmured. This really is lovely. She tipped her head back to look at the stars, exposing her long, smooth neck. I watched the pulse in her jugular hungrily. Bella lowered her head, looking around. How often do you come here? Every week or so, I replied, moving slowly closer. Whenever I need to get away. Her eyes focused on my face again. Deep, deep eyes. Knowing eyes. How did you find it? I shrugged, now standing only a foot away from her. I hike a lot on the weekends. I just stumbled upon it one day. She sat on the ground, a little ungracefully, and then lay back to see the stars again. I stared at her, wondering why I wasn't feeding yet. She was here, alone, far from witnesses. Her wrist lay exposed, the pulse thudding almost imperceptibly in her veins, dark under her translucent skin. I could drink slowly from her there, letting the rich liquid slide over my tongue. But instead of attacking, I found myself down next to her. Something about this girl made her so very intriguing. My interest, my curiosity, such human responses, I thought with disdain, overpowered my thirst for the moment, but not forever. There was no harm in enjoying her until I was absolutely ready. Do you have any siblings, Edward? She asked, turning her head to see me properly. No, an easy question. Do you? No, she sighed. My parents divorced when I was 2, so there was no time for them. And then my dad never remarried, and my mom didn't want any more children when she remarried. She was always more the child than the mother anyway. I always wished I had an older sibling, though, someone who could look after me for a change. Your father didn't look after you? She shook her head, casting off more waves of her fragrance. He tried, but by the time I moved in with him, I could take care of myself. Besides, he couldn't cook at all. I laughed as expected. That's unfortunate. It's almost easier now, she said, with only myself to worry about. That reminded me of something she'd said earlier. Why did you stay in Washington then, if you hate the wet? Cheaper, she sighed, and my friend Angela wanted to be roommates, so it seemed as good as any other option. We fell silent then. She closed her eyes, and I wondered what she was thinking and why her mind held no answers for me. In a way, though, it was nice to be with another person and not hear the chatter of their mind. I studied her face as her eyes remained closed. A pretty enough girl, I suppose, a little wan, but her skin had a wonderful translucent quality that made her blood that much more apparent. It had been a long time since I'd really looked at a human this way. They were so delicate, like spun glass. My eyes roamed over her eyelashes, falling against her cheeks, her plump, bow-shaped mouth. I found myself reaching out to trace those lips, curious as to how they would feel. Her eyes opened, looking hungrily back at me, but definitely not with the kind of hunger I felt. I didn't pull my hand away immediately, intrigued by the pillowy softness. What would a kiss feel like? How would warm, soft lips feel against mine? I heard her intake of breath as I leaned in, could almost taste the tantalizing sweetness. Very carefully, I placed my lips against hers. I expected the softness, the warmth. I'd known being this close would make the venom flow freely, but I didn't expect her to react like tinder to a flame, throwing her arms around my neck and pressing her body closer. I didn't expect the tingles of electricity that crackled through my body. For a moment I was stunned by the heady scent of her blood all around me, the feel of the pulse in her hands, and the rapid thud of her heart. I could bite her lip now, and the sweet ambrosia would flow into my mouth. I was entirely prepared to do just that when her mouth opened under mine, and I felt the wet heat of her tongue against my lips. It was exquisite. Two desires battled within me as I let her tongue into my mouth, the desire to taste and the desire to touch. I didn't know why this girl wanted to kiss me this way, but not knowing was freeing. No distractions, just feeling her warm little body against mine. Take her, some long dormant instinct screamed. Her blood will be there after. It's been so long. Take her. I groaned and gave over to that instinct. Our tongues tangled. She tasted like heaven. I pulled her slowly into my lap, feeling the shock of her heat against my cock as she straddled me. Evidently she liked it too. Her moan vibrated on my lips. I wondered, as my body moved on autopilot, my lips exploring the fragile line of her jaw, my hand beneath her shirt, on her smooth hip. If I could really do this without killing her, did I even care? It really wouldn't do to stop now. I was already hard. Vampire erections were a hell of a lot harder to get rid of than human ones. After all, I knew she would let me do anything I wanted with her. Her arousal flooded the air, very nearly as delectable as her blood. Yes, she would willingly let me touch her any way I liked. I had to try, had to feel the exquisite sensation of a tight cunt around me. It really had been far too long. Decision made. I lifted her shirt. She raised her arms and allowed me to pull it off and toss it onto the grass. Immediately, I pulled her back to me and reached around to unclasp her bra. It was gone just as quickly. Her heavy breaths echoed in my ears as I palmed her bare breasts. Oh, so soft. My groan must have sounded oddly desperate to her ears, but she was heaven compared to the few vampires I'd been with, their thoughts always full of inane worries about size or somewhere else entirely. I couldn't imagine those thoughts in Bella's head, not when she'd writhed and moaned in my arms. I loved the way her flesh filled my hands. Consumed, I lowered my head to taste her rosy nipples. Her answering cry mingled with the taste of my tongue like sweet nectar. I would make all my honey from her lush flower. Her hips ground into mine in a silent plea. A growl tore from my throat as I imagined that action with our clothing off. My cock buried inside her wet heat, her breasts bouncing as she rode me. Yes, I needed this badly. Edward, she panted, her hands fisting in my hair. My name sounded delicious on her lips, and I enjoyed the glazed look in her eyes. This innocent creature suddenly looked so wanton, so uninhibited. Awakening her darker side excited me. Sweet, corrupted innocence. More, she breathed, fumbling at the hem of my shirt. I lifted it off myself, sparing her shaking hands, which fell immediately to my skin, like metal to a magnet. Her hot, damp palms were electric shocks to my body. It was almost enough to start my stone heart. I already felt as though blood pulsed once more through my veins. This feeling was pure exhilaration. Her lips left my mouth and fastened on my neck, scraping with her teeth, sucking hard. I grinned to myself even as I moaned. She would make a great vampire. But I liked her human, I thought, as my hands roamed her soft skin. She was like a pillow in my arms, so pliable. I fought the urge to press in with my fingers, knowing they weren't meant to sink into her skin that way. Her arms wrapped around my shoulders as she continued her work on my neck, pressing her breasts delightfully against me. I reached around to cup her butt, bringing our bodies even closer. She gasped and bucked against me again. "More," she said for the second time. "Please, more." I was certainly ready for more. I lay her in the grass. She fell back like a rag doll, and I tugged her tennis shoes and socks off impatiently. They were unwelcome obstacles. Next her jeans, thick fabric, hiding creamy, luscious skin. What an atrocity! The button popped, the zipper flew down, and they too were in the grass. The musky scent of her arousal drifted up stronger now, tickling my senses. The urge to taste overwhelmed me. I lowered my head between her legs and breathed deeply. A little whimper escaped her throat and she squirmed. I didn't look to see why, but rather pulled the delicate cotton fabric down her legs and grazed my fingers up her smooth thighs. Without a thought, I buried my nose in her soft curls and tasted the sweetness between her folds. She was the sweetest ambrosia, too luscious for any mere mortal to bear. Thank God I was supernatural. Did her blood even matter if her sex tasted this good? I was mesmerized between her taste and the keening sounds she made as I worked her with my tongue. She sounded like a little kitten, a kitten that didn't stand a chance. "Edward," she moaned out as I circled her clit with my tongue. It sent a thrill down my spine, straight to my cock. I ached to be inside her. Reaching up to touch her, I felt her wet folds under my fingertips, the silky skin that would be so achingly pleasurable around me. I groaned against her, and she answered with another moan. I flicked my tongue faster against her and began gently moving my fingers. I wanted to make her come before I took her, wanted to witness her falling apart just for me, in all her innocent glory. Edward, oh!" Her cries grew sharper, and I felt her little hand fist in my hair. Her nails scraped against my scalp, tickling more than anything. I curled my fingers up, trying to push her over the edge. Her hips jerked in response, and I saw her free hand grasping at the grass beneath her. Her poor heart sounded like a hummingbird trapped in her chest. A growl broke loose at that thought, and I wondered if it would scare her. But it was at that moment, with a loud cry, that her muscles clamped down with surprising strength around my fingers. I watched her carefully, admiring the way her skin flushed with heat, the graceful arch of her back, the beautiful exposed column of her neck. As she threw her head back, her mouth opened on a moan. It was a gorgeous sight. I didn't stop licking her, savoring the taste until her quaking diminished to a tremble. Her eyes were closed when I lifted myself away from her, and her chest heaved as she caught her breath. She really was a lovely little creature, fair-skinned and soft-featured, delicate like a porcelain doll. I wanted to take her home and put her on display only for my eyes to see. But those were the ridiculous thoughts of a man with unfulfilled wants. She was just a girl, no different from all the others. Her eyes fluttered open and she blushed to find me staring. I reached out to cup her warm cheek, feeling the hot blood pool just under the skin. But her eyes kept me locked in. They were little universes, deep and infinite, and all too wise for somebody so very young. It was too much. I felt as though she could see right through me. To break that connection, I took her lips again, and she responded readily, her little hands gripping my shoulders tightly. I bit back a gasp as her hands slid down my back, feeling her way down. I growled in surprised enjoyment and pressed into her, my cock nestled against her sex. She gasped aloud. "Do you want this?" I asked. I wasn't sure why. Did it matter what she wanted? But I didn't want to be like the men I used to kill, men who would hunt young girls and use them without even offering the mercy of death. She had to want it. "Yes," she breathed, striking me with those eyes again. They held me in their grip as I eased myself into her, carefully. I wanted this to work so badly. Already her heat enveloped me, excruciatingly tight, so silky. I moaned into her shoulder and pushed all the way in. She whimpered, and suddenly the smell of fresh blood assaulted my nose. I froze in shock, battling the burn in my throat. This was stupid. I should just taste her now. I could get sex anywhere, but blood that sweet, that intoxicating, oh, that was a rare pleasure. I glanced up, almost ready to strike, when I saw a tear roll down her cheek. It hit me hard. She was in pain. Bella must be a virgin. Of course she was. She'd been so sweet, so innocent, and I had made her bleed. I didn't say I was sorry. That was a little too close to remorse, a little too human, but I tried not to move or breathe, tried not to lose my tenuous grasp on control. "Are you okay?" I finally asked in a whisper. "Yes," she breathed, clutching my arms. "Don't stop." I struggled to move slowly, shuddering as I pulled out of her heat and pushed back in. I'd never felt anything like this before. Without her thoughts echoing around in my head, I could focus solely on sensation, and the sensations were brilliant. She was so hot. It felt like she was on fire, and her body was incredibly responsive. I wanted to stay within her, wrapped in her soft skin forever, with her little body shooting electricity through me like a human generator. "Edward," that gasp was from pleasure. A shiver shot down my spine, and I wondered if I could make her moan my name, make her scream it. I increased my pace slightly, and the electricity doubled, tripled. It was infinite, unrelenting pleasure, too much and not nearly enough, and she responded instantly, moaning and arching her back so that her soft breasts pressed into my chest. It was all I could do to keep control, tearing at the grass beneath my fingers, digging into the damp earth. I wanted so badly to let go and drive into her, to feel the exquisite friction between my cold skin and her burning skin at its height. But I wanted to feel her reactions too, her muscles fluttering around me and her little hands clutching my back. Alluring little thing. I wanted to have her again and again until her innocence was completely corrupted, and I could, couldn't I? If I could take my pleasure and leave her undamaged, I could have her again. Edward, she moaned now, and I saw that her eyes were trained on me, watching my every move. I found myself captivated by her flushed cheeks and her parted lips that let out little puffs of air as she panted. More, she pleaded, digging her nails and pushing her hips into mine. Please, harder. How could I resist a request like that? If she could handle it harder, I was more than happy to comply. I moved faster, a little more forcefully than before. Throwing her head back, she cried out wantonly, and I growled at the sight of her exposed throat, that barely perceptibly thump of her pulse under the skin. My mouth watered, but that was nothing compared to the heat that rushed over me, the raging pleasure she caused. The little cries coming from her mouth grew louder with every thrust until she suddenly tensed, her thighs tightening around me, her hands gripping my arms, and her inner walls clamping down around my cock. She shook and spasmed with the force of her climax, mouth open in a scream that formed my name, but I barely noticed. I was too caught up in the tidal wave of pleasure that crashed into me and triggered my own release, the best I'd had in my very long life. I retained the presence of mind to roll off of her, lest I crush her, and fell onto my back beside her. A quick glance showed me her eyes were closed as she caught her breath. Now would be the time to bite her. She wouldn't have time to realize what was happening before it was all over, but I'd grown just a little bit accustomed to her scent, and it left my head clear enough to realize that she could offer more than a meal. Sex had never felt as good as it did with Bella, and I didn't want to take a chance of losing that. Maybe it was her humanness that made it so good, and maybe the silence of her mind, but whatever the case, perhaps I should leave her alive until I find out for certain. I heard her moving about, searching for her clothing, and I made my decision. I had to have her again. My eyes opened, and I watched her wriggle into her panties before I started putting on my own clothes. She kept her eyes averted from me, and I wished I could hear her thoughts. If I was going to see her again, I would need to reassure her somehow. "Are you ready to leave?" I asked, when we were both dressed. She finally looked up to me and nodded, biting her lip. I placed a hand on her back and guided her through the trees to my waiting car, helping her into the passenger seat before sliding behind the wheel. In the darkness of the vehicle, she seemed to relax infinitesimally. I kept a close eye on her, watching her twist her fingers on her lap as she stared straight ahead. "I didn't realize you were a virgin," I said, her face colored with a blush. "Did I hurt you?" "No," she finally spoke, glancing over at me. "I mean, no more than was inevitable." I nodded, unsure what to say next. This wasn't a situation I'd ever been in before. In the end, I settled for silence as I drove her back to her dormitory. It was awkward, but I didn't want to say anything that would give her the wrong idea, which was ridiculous, I realized, since I'd done nothing but give her the wrong idea all night. But I didn't want her getting too attached. That was just cruel. Once I'd stopped in front of her building, she immediately began fumbling to get out of her seat belt. She'd reached the door handle when I finally decided on what to say. "Can I see you again?" Her head turned and her eyes clearly reflected her surprise, but there was also happiness, which made me certain she would come back to me willingly. "Yes, I'm in room 36, she said, biting that lip again. "Come find me, if you want."